emissions. So many of you have heard about the term greenwashing. We're going to talk about greenhushing, which is a different thing. It is holding back information about net zero targets, either after a net zero target has been published and kind of retracting that, or if an organization sets a net zero target and they're not fully transparent, sharing the progress that they're making towards that. We see this as an emerging challenge. So the Climate Registry last year, we launched the Net Zero portal, and that is getting voluntary information from organizations about their net zero targets in a lot of detail. And one challenge that we've found in that process is that there are organizations that we know have done work on sustainability and have looked at net zero and have formally or informally adopted a net zero target, but the detail of it is not always clear. Sometimes the intent is there, but we need to be able to see a feasible pathway towards meeting that target. So we have a panel here today, all folks that are working in the net zero space, looking at net zero from different perspectives. We have right here John Lang, Net Zero Lead with the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. We have Emily Faint, Net Zero Policy Manager with the British Standards Institution, and Paul Huggins, Associate Director at the Carbon Trust. So we're going to go through and hear a little bit about the net zero work they're doing from different perspectives, hear about what their observations about this greenhushing unfortunate trend that we're seeing, and then talk about some solutions, how we can help avoid that, and really make the case that companies should avoid holding back their information, but really try to get it out there. And if it's something that they can improve, there's ways of doing that and a precedent that they can tap into in order to make that happen. So, John, let's start with you.
Hello. It's on. Hello. So my name is John Lang, and I have the great privilege of running an international consortium project called the Net Zero Tracker. So I work for ECIU, or the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, and my partners are New Climate Institute, based in Germany. We have Takeshi here in the crowd. Oxford Net Zero, based out of the University of Oxford, of course, and the Data-Driven EnviroLab, which is US-based. And essentially what the Net Zero Tracker does is we're a transparency and accountability tool. So we track all nations in the world, every region in the 25 largest emitting nations in the world, every city with over 500,000 people, and the 2,000 largest companies in the world. And what we try to do using Oxford University students as volunteers, which are the engine behind the Net Zero Tracker, we try and surface integrity metrics to basically work out whether these entities are being serious about their net zero pledges. And what we're trying to do is create the most comprehensive, consistent and comparable database in the world, because after all, there are massive reporting gaps out there. So that's essentially what the Net Zero Tracker does. We've got other features, but I won't bore you with them now.
We'll get into those.
Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Faint. I'm the Net Zero Policy Manager at BSI, or the British Standards Institution, if it's your first time meeting us. BSI is the UK's national standards body for the formal international standard system, namely those of ISO, IEC, and ITU. But I don't want the UK part to fool you. BSI absolutely does work and engage internationally, and never more so than now in the net zero space. And in particular, a development that I'm sure we'll talk about in the context of greenhushing is our work on convening over 1,200 organizations from over 100 countries to develop the ISO Net Zero Guidelines, which is the first deliverable in the international standard system to define net zero for the very first time and to set out what the high integrity criteria for a credible net zero journey actually looks like. So this is something that we are really committed to and really passionate about in BSI. And a key reason behind this tool that we want to make sure more and more people know about is because we want to reframe net zero as the journey that it is, rather than leaving organizations to have to pick their way through a very fragmented landscape of reporting standards and target setting standards and other initiatives without a clear view of actually what good looks like across the whole piece. So I'm sure we'll get more into that later in this discussion, but it's really great to be here.
You should be on. I think you're on. Yeah.
Hello, my name's Carbon Trust. My name's not Carbon Trust. My name's Paul
He is
Huggins
the
from
Carbon
the
Trust.
I've been
Right
at the,
here.
I've been at the Carbon Trust for 18 years, and if you cut me in half, it would say Carbon Trust. The Carbon Trust is an organisation that was set up by the UK government originally to help the UK tackle climate. And after the first decade, we span out to be an independent consultancy, climate consultancy, specifically focused on helping industry and government and the public sector to transition to net zero in today's language. We probably do three things around net zero that's worthwhile articulating. Half our business activity, we work with businesses to help them down the net zero pathway using the SBTI standard. And we make sure that when we work with those organizations, we really gently challenge them and gently encourage them to use the purity of SBTI net zero to give them focus and targeting on where they're going to go, and then help them set their targets. We also work at a sector level. So instead of setting an SBTI for an organization, we work with the sector to set a sector level SBTI around which organizations in that sector can then understand where they might sit. So it gives this sector level language, and that's really important. We'll come back to on greenhushing. And then we work as well with governments to help them understand what net zero is really about, and then how they can build the ecosystem of policy enabling environment in order to cultivate net zero, including things like the technologies, et cetera, that these companies need to actually embrace and move down the net zero pathway. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you all for the introducing yourselves. Strong UK representation on the panel here, but that's why we come to COP, to learn from international folks, like what is working in their jurisdictions. And the Climate Registry, we're based in California. We're starting to see a lot of regulations, legislation that's requiring disclosure of net zero. So we look to the rest of the world, what's working in other jurisdictions and what could be applied there, best practices to help companies and agencies in California on their net zero journeys, and being clear and transparent about that work that they're doing. John, I want to start with a report that you worked on that came out over the summer. It's the Net Zero Stock Take, I believe it was called. Had some really good insights into the state of the net zero market right now. We know there's been a lot of net zero commitments from companies. What really stood out is that, to me, is that there's still a long way to go in terms of the quality and the amount of net zero commitments that still need to happen. Can you speak to a little bit about that report?
Yeah, that is right. Thanks, Dan. Actually, Takeshi, who's in the crowd, actually led that analysis. So he might be in a better position to be up here speaking to it. I think he has to nip off soon, but maybe we could get an insight from him later on. So yes, we released this global stock take in June, and it landed spectacularly, to be honest. We were just speaking about it. It really kind of changed the context of the bond intercessional. So what we found at the corporate level, because of course greenhushing is a corporate phenomenon at the moment, hopefully it doesn't sift off into cities and regions. What we found was that the quality is really, really lacking. So the quantity, what we call the intent, is still moving forward. Today, I think we've got 1,023 companies out of 2,000 with a net zero or similar target. But coming back to the quality side, and we classify that as integrity. So our tagline is from intent through integrity to implementation. And our bread and butter, the tracker, is the integrity. So what we found, I think the most useful statistic is what we call minimum procedural requirements of what good net zero looks like. And so for that, we borrow from the Race to Zero starting line. And so we borrow 6 criteria. So number one, does the company have a pledge? Number two, is it proceeding immediately? Does it have an interim target by 2030? Does it publish annually? And also, help me out here, Takeshi, I've forgotten the fourth one. While he's thinking, you have to cover all scopes, so scope 3 emissions, and also clarify what you're doing on offsets, and if you intend to use offsets, to place at least one condition on that. The very obvious one is a plan. So we need them to have detailed plans. So we use those 6 criteria as minimum procedural requirements, and what we found is less than 5%, I think 4% of companies actually meet those minimum procedural requirements, and we haven't even got into the substance yet. So that is a real worry. So balancing that, in the global stocktake, and this is speaking directly to greenhushing, we wanted to balance the ledger slightly, because what we've been guilty of at the tracker over the last couple of years is focusing on those entities with net zero targets, not those who are doing nothing at all. So what we did is we actually, another statistic to bring this to life, is we found that 37% of companies don't have any mitigation target whatsoever. And so what we actually decided to do just after that June stocktake is actually to name and shame those 37%, and that went kind of against our founding principles, because we wanted to have an impartial and independent reputation. But we thought, no, we need to actually point out these actors that are not moving at all. And what we are determined to do at the tracker is actually continue to do that, but also on the other side of the ledger is recognise those leaders that are doing really well. So last year, the UN expert group, I think it's called colloquially within the climate community, H-League, but we call it the UN expert group. They delivered 10 recommendations. And what we'd like to do at the tracker is actually show exemplars of entities that are doing really well on one of those recommendations, even if they're not doing great on 4 or 5 of the others. Because everyone loves a hero, we need to be showing those entities, those corporates that are doing good things. And I think we actually have to think about leaving the others alone somewhat, because we don't necessarily want to put too much pressure on them. Yes, we need things to become mandatory, but we just need to be careful naming and shaming that middle lot that have signed up to these targets, have got a net zero target, have some integrity, but may not be hitting best practice. So we do have to be careful with that, but we really need to focus on that 37%. So I'll leave it there for now. But yeah, we really want to tackle this greenhushing issue. Takeshi and I spoke yesterday about actually doing an analysis next year to see if there has been backtracking across our entities. But yeah, that's yet to be fleshed out. But I thought I'd mention that because I think Takeshi has to leave soon.
Thank you, John. So John just mentioned a few indicators of, quality net zero reporting and, what goes into that and what to look for when you're trying to assess good net zero. Emily, you've worked on guidelines for net zero. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those things that you look for net zero targets? Like, what would be something that an organization could be proud of showing of their net zero target?
I love that question because I actually want to push back on the concept of looking at net zero targets in isolation for a second. Because actually, to the point earlier, what we wanted to do by helping to stitch the entire landscape of net zero action together with the ISO net zero guidelines is actually help organizations take that breath and step back and look at their entire transformation rather than focusing just on target setting and just on reporting. And for the reasons that John and the Net Zero Tracker brilliantly set out, we do need to make sure that we are incentivizing action. We're not penalizing it. And actually, net zero is a journey. I mean, we often talk about 2050 targets. We're going to be at this for a while. I'm sure I'm not the first person to have made that point at this COP. We're going to be at this for a while, and so we need to actually find frameworks to incentivize all the changes that will be needed to drive the net zero transition, not just looking at people on the basis of whether they've set a net zero target and whether they've reported their emissions yesterday. Those are incredibly, incredibly important metrics. But actually, we need to find ways to recognize and celebrate those who are making lots of changes to underpin those targets. So a great example would be, have you got someone on your board for the first time, a CSO in a company, who is empowered at that board level to say, actually, this is an incredibly important part of our future business strategy. This isn't something that I'm leaving to one or two desperately overworked sustainability officers who are fighting for senior level attention. And I am going to be the person that challenges the CFO in board meetings and said, no, we need to put investments into this transition now, not delay it year after year after year. Yeah. That is also an incredibly important indicator of a company transitioning to net zero. And it's there's a whole section in the ISO net zero guidelines on leadership and commitment and how your governance can be transformed. And so I really love the message that John set out here, which is actually we do need to be positively incenting. We do need to be careful and not just engage with companies and organizations more broadly through that penalizing lens. Another thing that we look for, and again, I'm also a big fan of the Global Stocktake report because it put the ISO net zero guidelines on that column of what good net zero looks like. Because as well as the key metrics of covering all scopes, making sure you have a target and a credible baseline, the ISO net zero guidelines also talk about things like the integration of considerations for biodiversity of nature. The COP28 presidency has really elevated the role of nature here in Dubai, and I think that's a really fantastic step forward because we do need to think about how we are building resilient net zero transitions, mindful of the environment, mindful of biodiversity and of adaptation needs as well. And the ISO net zero guidelines sets out a framework to make sure that you can evidence that those considerations are built in now, not just as an afterthought. Of course, signposting to key frameworks such as TNFD to help you do this and deliver this at a rigorous level. So there's lots of different areas within the guidelines I do really encourage organizations to look at if it helps, because it helps you step back again, reframe net zero as a journey, and actually just help make those arguments internally as to why certain decisions need to be taken now, and not just because you've set a public net zero target, but because actually it's good for your business strategy. If you want to be viable in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, you have to make some decisions now. It's not good enough to leave a target out there in public. You will need to make some decisions now and build that into your business now, and that's something that it can help you do. So all of the above, plus others I'm sure we don't have time to go into today, are some of the things that the guidelines recommends that credible net zero looks for.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. You know, it seems before jumping into setting a net zero target, you mentioned that, you know, you want this to be lead to real progress and have a pathway laid out. So I imagine there's a lot of feasibility thought that needs to go into how to do that, a strategy and milestones on the path to doing that. So Paul, I'm interested to hear from kind of an advisory perspective when you're working with organizations. What are some of the recommendations that you would make if a company is considering going net zero? You know, in terms of feasibility of timelines, maybe a certain year attached to it. Is it out to 2045? We see this trend of like earlier and earlier. You know, 2028 or something, and it's like, is that really going to happen? So what are some of the things that you're looking for in terms of advisory on helping set feasible targets?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I mean, fundamentally, to transform any organization to the level needed to achieve net zero takes a long time. So if an organization is giving a very short run target, they've either been working at this for a very long time or they don't understand what net zero is. I'm just going to pause at the moment, just regroup on what net zero means and then jump off again in a way, which is, so net zero fundamentally and how it differs with carbon neutral, and I think a lot of companies are saying the net zero, but they mean carbon neutral, is that it has to cover all three scopes, as we said earlier on, scopes 1, 2, and 3. You know, so that's the emissions in the company itself, that's the emissions from the energy the company uses, and it's the emissions in the supply chain. So it has to cover all three of these different factors. And then within that, it has to look to drive down those emissions across the board by about 90% on average. And then the residual 10%, it needs to be thinking about some form of offsetting. Now, the ideal situation is they don't really worry about the offsetting bit until much later down the road. But what companies might want to do is be investing in capacity building so that in the future there are some great offsets out there. Because I know we could go off in a direction on voluntary carbon markets and all the interesting challenges that are there, but the reality is that they need to improve quite a lot. So any early stage target has to be questioned with a pinch of salt, even if it's a valid target. More importantly, we're going back to your question, which is so we'd like to start off really with either an organisation or a sector, recognising that this is a tough challenge, recognising from the get-go there's data issues, and because of those data issues, there's only so much that actually can be reasonably projected forward. So we then not to think about proxies and things like this, but more importantly, we want to make sure that it's credible, what's going forward in terms of target setting. And then we want to make sure that the targets are consistent with whether it's the SBTI pathways or the IEA pathways to give some sense of urgency and action around those. But more importantly, it's going back to some points made earlier on, which is it isn't just about targets. You can have a great report, but a terrible business in this sense. So really, we also like to make sure that the climate risks have been recognised and that they are being managed appropriately. But as importantly, two different things. One is that the use of finance has been recognised, and we typically would look to organisations and say, where's the claims and declarations on your finance? How are you going to invest in these organisations? So one company, for example, just to bring one simple example, Electrolux, the Swedish appliances manufacturer, has taken out green bonds, and it's used those green bonds to retool its factories in the USA to produce more efficient appliances. So that's a very good example of where they've taken the money and they've invested on their journey to net zero. Okay, but I think I might say, and Electrolux wouldn't even say at the minute they're on net zero. They would say they're heading towards net zero, which I think is the reality. Because another thing we need to think about, and I think it's really important for greenhushing, is that there's this desire to jump on and say you've got to be at net zero immediately. Actually, the best we can be is on a journey. We're all on that journey, and it comes to, is that journey transparent and engaged? And I think that's where we need to be having a discussion in the future.
Sense.
Just quickly on that, yeah, I completely agree, because we do have this semantic issue around carbon neutrality versus net zero, and net zero CO2 especially. But actually, one thing we actually found, not this year, but last year, one of our main findings from our global stocktake in 2022 was that those entities with 2025, 2030 net zero targets actually relied massively more on offsets. And it was quite telling, actually, that statistic from last year. So yeah, completely agree. The data backs that up.
Okay, I heard a few times mentioned the term credibility, and I want to just kind of focus in on that real quick. At the Climate Registry, we have, right on our sign here, credible carbon reporting. So we're using the term, and one of the things that we use to define that is verification. So looking at things like reduction and as a requirement of reporting to for an inventory to require third-party verification. And this question can go to anyone. Are you finding in your work that having a verification or validation of a target or the underlying either the carbon credits that are being used or the inventory, is it helpful to provide some assurance that these targets are being met and showing like regular progress, demonstrating that the pathway is that it's on track?
I can jump in on that one. I mean, absolutely. I think this is again a great example of how best practice criteria is consolidating and converging, and we do know what good looks like for huge swathes of net zero. If your baseline, if your reporting, if your reductions, they're not verified by a third party, you shouldn't expect anyone to find your data credible. That's just a key tenet now, I think, of the governance landscape. And also, I think the point you mentioned, Dan, I think a couple of us have mentioned now on the interim targets, that is so key. Because as we've mentioned already, we're going to be at this for a while. Net zero is a journey. It's going to take decades to get us there for pretty much all organizations. So it is good for your organization, as well as, those who may wish to scrutinize your journey, to have evidence of those interim targets and those milestones on the way. It's good for you because if you are off track through unexpected factors that may come in and throw you off course, then you can identify that early enough and put in measures to put those things back into place, to have a correction mechanism. That was something that was identified in the UN high-level expert group. John mentioned its key criteria in the ISO net zero guidelines. And actually, I'd love to sort of pay tribute to some of the fantastic case study organizations who have thrown their hat in the ring this year to adopt the guidelines first and show how it can be done. And actually, General Motors, one of our case studies, who announced themselves this week, are committing to putting in interim targets on their journey as a result of using the guidelines. So this is a way that even the biggest of businesses are recognizing we need to add more rigor, more detail, and actually, that's good for us. It's not about hiding things or feeling like we're going to get a backlash. It's actually good for us to have that level of detail because that means we can guide our own journey better. So I think the answer is absolutely, but we should remember it's not just from a perspective of being scrutinized, but actually it helps you on your journey too.
Yeah.
Just very quickly, we're talking about credibility and we're also talking about verification. There is one wrinkle there. We actually need credible verifiers.
Yep.
As well.
Good point.
Because there is a problem at the moment within the climate ecosystem, and I'm not going to name names, but we actually need to verify the verifiers and make sure that they are getting it right as well. There are instances, again, I'm not going to name names, but where where entities are not covering all scopes, certainly not covering all Scope 3 emissions, and they're being validated, and then they think that the job's done.
Yeah.
And even if they don't have a robust strategy to address those other areas, whether it's upstream or downstream of those Scope 3 emissions. So watch the space, because I don't know whether the Net Zero Tracker is in the best position to do it, but we do need to be vigilant of that.
Point. Anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to come in as well, which is it's good to triangulate on top of that. So I absolutely agree on the verification there. But we look at it as well as the verifying pathways. We also, something I was saying earlier on, also the green finance. So when you take out green bonds, you have to statutorily report with the full force of financial accounting on an annual basis, which gives much more power and much more integrity to the information that's being shared. So it's quite interesting sometimes to see what's stated in a green bond supplement versus what's stated in the sustainability report, for example. So that's, I think, a first aspect of corroboration, of green validation. And I think another aspect as well, actually, is I encourage companies to share what they're doing and open it up for debate with their peers and their competitors, because there's nothing much more interesting than competitors challenging back, saying, we don't quite get how you've managed to do that. And it might be that learnings then get shared, or it might be that actually it isn't the way they thought it was. And then there's learning and there's development there. But I think that builds on transparency with respect, so that it's not a kicking shop, but it's actually it's a development of knowledge sharing that allows things to move forward in a validated, highly validated, and semi-validated way.
Thank you. So one thing that I've heard from practitioners, sustainability practitioners working within companies, is that they get an assignment to work on this net zero thing. They see that there's challenges associated with that, but it seems there needs to be some communication between those departments, C-suite, and also marketing and those that are out there with the messaging. What are some things that can be done there in order to kind of take these silos and kind of bridge those a little bit, and so to improve the net zero pathway? Thoughts?
If I could jump in enthusiastically on that question, as sort of mentioned earlier, I think that, again, this is where the existing landscape of standards and requirements haven't made this clear enough that actually there is such a huge amount of internal alignment within an organization to make this possible. Again, in the ISO Net Zero guidelines, but also drawing on key criteria from other major initiatives such as the Race to Zero, it is becoming clearer and clearer in this landscape that a credible net zero strategy involves aligning not just your internal governance in terms of reporting and decision making, but aligning your policy and your advocacy work too. A lot of our case studies that have adopted the guidelines have actually made decisions to start encouraging regular meetings between, for example, their commercial teams, their sustainability operations teams, their communications teams, their external affairs teams, because they are recognizing that for most of us, we may be doing things to counter our own net zero progress unintentionally. It's not something that's coming from a malicious place. It's not something to penalize organizations for necessarily. It's actually, we haven't given them the framework to even put the spotlight on that problem in the first place. And as a result of some of these initiatives I mentioned, we are now starting to do that and make that clearer. So I think, again, back to the internal transformation point, it is so clear that credible net zero now doesn't just involve the metrics we've spoken about, which are incredibly important, but also making sure that the right people are talking to each other internally, because you do not want to have your external affairs team lobbying for or advocating for measures that may advantage one aspect of your organization, but maybe unintentionally making your net zero journey that much harder.
Yeah, thank you.
And yeah, I'll just jump in very quickly as well. We do need to think about transparency here, because that's by far the most important thing. That's by far the first step for anything to be credible. It needs to be transparent. And it kind of relates to the journey. Like, there needs to be some humility. Like, this is really hard. This is like the hardest transition ever, that humanity may ever undertake. So there needs to be humility, and just be transparent, be honest. And then related to Em's point is, don't penalise them for that. If they've been humble, if they've been transparent, let's give them credit for that. Yeah. They should be recognised for that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I'm just going to come back to a point that I may have just touched on earlier on, which is in January we released on behalf of the IFC a net zero roadmap for copper and nickel mining, which was a 2.5-year piece of work. I had a very strongly engaged industry. All of the major miners were on board, and the documents that were delivered specifically for certain segments of an operating business, whereby we informed very clearly to the C-suite what net zero was, what was the journey to net zero, what were the technologies needed to net zero, what was the financing requirements for net zero, what were the risks, etc., in a way that C-suite listened to. And at the same time, we developed an entirely different package of outcomes and deliverables for the operating business to say, and this is how you implement it. So that this idea of trying to describe the entirety of net zero in a very succinct way that people can go back to again and again and again creates that narrative and that journey that everyone can follow. One, I think the challenges quite often is that I've genuinely heard this once or twice in the Carbon Trust, where the C-suite commit to net zero, and then about 4 months later, the operating business explains what they've just committed to.
Yeah, I've seen it too.
And then they think, oh, okay, how are we gonna take that forward in a different way? Yeah.
Sure. Sense. I want to turn it to the audience and ask if there are any questions about net zero, what you've heard, or anything. Any?
Could we pass the mic to Takeshi? I don't know if he has to run, but to talk about the accountability loop report that you worked on, because I think that was really interesting.
You will be a panelist, I'm afraid.
Yes,
Takeshi.
yes.
You're just too good at what you do. You must be a panelist.
Sorry, Takeshi, and you can take the conversation in any direction you like, because I know you are like very curious about this greenhushing phenomenon.
Sure. But I actually wanted to ask you guys questions, if you don't mind. Yeah. So I'm Takeshi Kuramochi from New Climate Institute, running Net Zero Tracker project as well as Climate Action Tracker. So there hasn't been no greenhushing tracker so far, and probably that's something, as John said, we should do at one point. But according to your sort of knowledge or intelligence, what kind of tendencies or kind of trends you see among the companies or other, or subnational governments kind of started Greenhushing. So are they sincere and more humble entities that are seriously concerned about, the sort of their own reputation, and to stick to what they can actually do, or is it more greenwashing companies, being caught and say, "Oh, oops," then we'll just pull back the claims. So
Yeah.
what do you see? What trends do you see among different actors and non-state actor groups, and also across geographies?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I'd be able to answer that very thorough question to full credit. But what I will start off with is that what we've definitely seen, and we've got some research that's going to be coming out in early January, is that green hushing is more likely to occur in organizations that are only focused on scopes 1 and 2 at the moment. And if organizations have gone to scope 3, they're less likely to be green hushing. Now, there's some logical sense in that, because I think organizations, when they just focus on 1 and 2, feel they've got a big problem and they need to sort that out. And then typically speaking, they realize that their problem scales or fails into insignificance when compared to the scope 3 emissions. And I also think it lends itself to the fact that organizations by that time have developed more, and therefore they're happy to go forward and be more open and discussive about what they're on about. But there's another point, I think it's really important that we are seeing occasionally, which is, I'm going to sadly throw another acronym in now. So we're seeing from green hushing going to green stalling, where organizations, they've stopped communicating, and actually, particularly when it's scope 1 and 2, they're going, actually, now we don't know what to do. What we do know is if we say anything, someone's going to have a go at us. So therefore, they don't not want to do stuff, but they don't know what to do either. So that's taking a bit of a strain, because actually, I think it's fair to say that there isn't enough capacity in the sustainability market at the moment to help all organizations at the same time get down net zero. So there is a lag effect, therefore, that's being caused by that. But I do have a strong plea for organizations that are green hushing at the moment, which is green hushing means they're not collaborating. And if they're not collaborating, that will have a profound effect on policy development. And the policy development will have a profound effect, therefore, on net zero activity. So there's a real vicious loop that we need to make sure gets broken, because the reality is that I think some organizations are green hushing because they've got a lot of flack. I think maybe in America more than in Europe, but that might be wrong. We need to somehow stop that happening. Nobody's perfect. No organization's perfect. There's no point challenging constantly and aggressively simply because they're not able to do what they've claimed to do. And as a point just said earlier on, if you look at company accounts, the CEO says, we're going to get growth 5% each year, and it goes up and down all the time. That's exactly what we should see in net zero pathways, it going up and down all the time. If it's not going up and down all the time, maybe they're not reporting as thoroughly as they should do. And there's something really important there, which is there should be like forwards and backwards a bit. That's credible. The other forecasting style graphics, maybe not so credible. Yeah, I'll pause there.
That's very true. It reminds me of 1.5 because, of course, we claim that it's over 1.5, in 1 year, but of course that doesn't represent the global trend. So yeah, the trend is the important bit. It can ebb and flow throughout that. I completely agree with that. There is Nestle, of course. I'm sure Takeshi's familiar. I mean, they withdrew all of their carbon neutral products because their consciousness was raised. They realised that they were in the wrong and that they were doing it wrong. I don't know how good their iteration or their strategic iteration is. I can't give details to that, but that's a step in the right direction. Again, that comes back to humility. And I think they have been rewarded in the market. Well, I'm not sure in the marketplace, but certainly in the media.
Thank you. That was a great question. Any others at zero?
If you don't mind, can I ask 2 more follow-up questions, maybe after others? If anyone?
This gentleman right here. Yeah.
Hi, hello. I think before going to the verification and the accuracy of the data, and we are lacking emission factors in the first place. And in many cases and many countries, and we are kind of making very rough estimation, even scope 1, 2. And, it's not necessarily based on what you are consuming, sometimes based on how much you spend, then you can make a rough calculation of the emissions. So how, I don't know the American situation, but how you are coping with more having accurate factor data, then who should pay for this?
Emissions factors.
Just the emissions
I'm,
factors.
yeah, so I'm not involved in the weeds. So I'm definitely at the macro. So I cannot comment on that. But I don't know whether it's a more appropriate for you, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, can you come as well? Can you? Okay. I was just to say, it's a very valid problem, a valid challenge, and particularly the more you go out of developed world countries, the more of a problem it becomes. So even many corporates, we've just finished a piece of work that we're releasing on Monday, and many corporates actually said that once they get into certain nations, they know that their competitors use different emissions factors, yet they're in the same location. And there's valid reasons why they use these different emissions factors. So I do think there needs to be an initiative of some nature to try and identify how those emissions factors are standardized. But you're absolutely right that at the moment, there are temples, let's call them, of emissions factors data, which quite often have to be paid for, or if they don't have to be paid for, they can't therefore be shared. So you do get this situation where, going back to validation, there is a number that a company has created in good faith based upon the data it's allowed to use, but can't explain how the data it's presented is in good faith. So that is a challenge. It's a valid challenge that needs more study.
And if I can come in on just one more comment on that to build on Paul's points, I think from an international standards perspective, I think I've used the word convergence a couple of times, and I think where we have this existing problem still of lots of different types of emissions factors and metrics and data being used, we are on the cusp, I think, of seeing a major step forward in far more convergence around different standard setters on what metrics should be used, on how things should be measured, and on how things should be described. We're not quite there yet, but I would say this COP alone has shown so many announcements that show we're going in that direction. So the ISO and IFRS, the IFRS, of course, being the foundation that's produced the very high-profile ISSB standards, have announced this past week that they are going to work closer together to drive greater interoperability. That's a huge deal. I don't think we've actually digested how big of a deal that is, because that's the most well-known emissions reporting standard in the world and the international standard system committing to driving interoperability. On the voluntary initiative side, we've also seen some of the major NGO initiatives that govern this landscape to date, namely SBTI, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, ICVCM and VCMI, agree to come together in an end-to-end integrity framework to make measurement, target setting, and the role of voluntary credits clearer. So we are not there yet, and I'm not going to pretend we live in this nice, harmonized utopia, but it is going in that direction. So hopefully these things will become clearer. And I love that you asked the question about who will pay for it, because I have a pet peeve of going to any event on net zero and not talking about the just transition and fair share. And and actually my co-panelists and I were having a conversation about this only last night, about how from a standard setting perspective, progress has been made in the sense of the ISO net zero guidelines standardizes. It has a whole clause on considerations for equity, wider empowerment, and a just transition. And it reflects as far as we've got in the world. It has considerations like understanding historical responsibility, acknowledging your capacity to act versus others, acknowledging that those with greater resources and capacity to act should be helping others to transition. It is not enough just to focus on your own emissions reductions. You should be helping others to do so, and aiming to get to net zero faster so that those who have resource constraints can get there later without us overshooting 1.5 in an ideal world. Now, again, we're not in a utopia. I'm not saying that therefore we've answered who should pay for it, but standardizing these considerations is going to mean that organizations know it is their duty to think about that question. They can't avoid that question, and that question, once the world and the market has developed some kind of methodology around that, could be something one day that we start to measure. We haven't got that far yet, but key progress has been made in standardizing that question, so it's not just the job of COP negotiators to talk about it, but actually every single one of us.
Thank you, Emily. Okay, well, I want to have just a quick parting shot, John, I know you have to get running, so I want to start with you. Any takeaways, any messages that you want to just leave the audience here about where you see opportunities for improvement, what path needs to be taken in order to really get that transparency happening?
Yeah, I think just to echo that point, it is about transparency and humility. I think I mentioned those two things, but also at the really high level, because I think that's a good way to leave it. Is that I think of it as we've got 4 gaps. So we've got a gap in action, obviously. We've got a gap in finance. We've got a gap in data, and we've got a gap in credibility. At the Net Zero Tracker, we're trying to take care of the latter two. So we need to think of it as in closing that gap. Bringing it back to the greenhushing, we need to reward those that are doing specific things really well, and we need to name and shame those that are doing nothing. But we have to be careful. We can't penalise. We have to be careful with those with that middle cohort of entities that have signed up to net zero, and we have to be willing for them to take a step back. To Paul's point, to take 2 steps forward.
Thank you. A lot of work to do there.
Thank you. I think from my perspective, I'd sort of give nuanced calls to actions really for different groups. I would say if you are an organisation struggling to know what step to take in your net zero journey, then some of the tools that all of us have mentioned can help you do that. I of course would recommend the ISO net zero guidelines, because we're already seeing case studies of organisations who've been able to make major steps forward in raising the integrity of their net zero commitments because they've used this tool. We've had feedback that it helps you tell that story better internally and get some of those critical decisions made internally that you need to move forward. I would say also, if you think that the existing standards landscape is not reflecting your concerns and what you need to move forward, I would encourage you to reach out to your government-appointed national standards body. In the UK, it's BSI, but you can find who your national standards body is at iso.org/members. And do actually get involved in standards development yourself. It exists to reflect your needs. So don't feel that this is something that is going to happen to you. You absolutely can have a voice in these proceedings. And then finally, I would say to the policymakers and to the regulators who are trying to build an enabling policy framework to help businesses decarbonize, do refer to these tools, to this data that's been highlighted today, because actually the criteria that we are forming convergence and consensus around gives you that much more credibility and a mandate to help put some of these things into policy to help businesses move faster.
Good message. Paul, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, these have been amazing closing thoughts. I'm trying to think how I can add in on these amazing closing thoughts. I think going back to John's, I think there's something around net zero culture that needs to be added in as well, because I think there's a lot of tensions and frustrations around which is causing greenhushing. And I think we need to somehow lance that ball, as the case may be.
What did you say, Paul? Net zero culture.
Culture.
Yeah.
And I think more broadly stepping back, I think there's 3 things for us always, which is are there pathways and plans which are credible? Is there engagement across the industry and with peers and those external to the industry to galvanize action and to recognize where good action's been taken and where learnings can be pulled into their businesses? Because we're all on this journey. You know, I look back 20 years when I started here, most of what we talk about now today didn't exist at all at the time. And then the other one that I think I do fall on quite regularly now is what's the green financing looking like? You know, because I think that creates a great segue into real action study, because if they're not financing it and showing how it is financed, you've got to question whether it really is being financed.
True.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay, well, we're at the end of the program, so let's just give a quick applause to our panelists here. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you
And
for having
thank you
us.
for attending.